All right, class, welcome back to part 2 of chapter 28, and we are going to be covering the female reproductive system. The female genital or reproductive system includes 2 ovaries, which are the female gonads, the uterine tubes, the uterus, vagina, and vulva. The functions are: ovaries produce secondary oocytes and hormones, progesterone, estrogen, inhibin, and relaxin. Uterine tubes transport the secondary oocyte to the uterus. The uterine tubes are normally the site of fertilization. The uterus site is the site of implantation of the fertilized ovum, and also where the development of the fetus occurs, and the site of labor. The vagina receives the penis during sexual intercourse, and it's also the passageway for childbirth. Mammary glands synthesize, secrete, and eject milk for newborn nourishment. So starting with the ovaries, these are the female gonads. They are paired glands that are homologous to the testes. Each of them are on either side of the uterus at a superior portion of the pelvic cavity. They produce gametes, which are the secondary oocytes that eventually mature into ova, and hormones, progesterone, estrogen, inhibin, and relaxin. The ovaries are supported in place by the broad ligament, the ovarian ligament, and the suspensory ligament. Here we see a transverse section cut through a woman's body here. The anterior portion is here, which is the rectus abdominis muscle. We see the bladder, and slightly above it and behind it is the uterus. On either side of the uterus, we have each ovary. Again, they are held in place by this ovarian ligament, the broad ligament, which is here, and then the suspensory ligament, which we see on, which is right here on this one. Okay. Coming off the ovaries, we have this uterine tube. The uterine tubes are attached directly to the uterus. Histology of an ovary. So the ovarian mesothelium covers the surface of the ovary. So here we have the mesothelium basically forming the outer surface. The tunica albuginea is the capsule of dense irregular connective tissue below the germinal epithelium. So the tunica albuginea, that is right here. The ovarian cortex is below the tunica albuginea and consists of ovarian follicles and stromal cells. And it is basically dense irregular connective tissue. So the cortex is going to be more of this outer layer here, okay? And you see developing follicles. The ovarian medulla is deep to the cortex, and it has loose connective tissue, blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and nerves. Now this diagram shows the development of a follicle and eventually its release and the degeneration of the follicle into the corpus luteum. I want to point out that when this happens in real life, it does not move around the ovary. It happens here, the whole thing happens here, and then it would happen here and here, and you know, so it doesn't occur like that. They're just trying to show all the steps within one ovary, okay? Ovarian follicles contain oocytes in various stages of development. Follicular cells are 1 layer thick, and granulosa cells are more than 1 layer thick. Okay, so let me show you I don't think we have a closer up one here. Well, I think in another slide we'll see that, but tertiary or Graafian follicles is one that's ready to rupture and expel the secondary oocyte at ovulation. So we start here at the primordial, then it becomes a primary follicle, a secondary follicle, a tertiary follicle, or what's called the Graafian follicle. At this stage, that secondary oocyte can then be expelled during ovulation. So ovulation is that, the expelling of the secondary oocyte. After it's expelled, this follicle becomes the corpus luteum. So it develops after ovulation when the empty follicle produces progesterone, estrogens, inhibin, and relaxin. It further degenerates into the corpus albicans. Okay. So oogenesis, this is similar to spermatogenesis. This is the formation of the female gamete. It occurs in the ovaries. It begins before a female is even born with the process of meiosis. When primordial germ cells migrate from the yolk sac to the ovaries during fetal development, they differentiate into oogonia, which are diploid. So this is occurring before you're even born. You have oogonia in the ovaries. The oogonia divide into germ cells, some of which become primary oocytes. These then enter meiosis 1, still in fetal development, but they don't complete this phase until after puberty. So they're in this, these primary oocytes go into meiosis 1 and they stay there. They're at this arrested development stage. At this stage, the follicle has one layer of follicular cells. It is called a primordial ovarian follicle. Okay, so that's where it's kind of stayed at until puberty. Here we see the primordial ovarian follicle. So here's a good slide of the ovary. It's been cut through. We see all these different stages of development of these follicles. But here you see the primordial follicle. That's how they are from birth until they start growing, okay? So more like in puberty, they may develop further, but there'll still be some after puberty. So here you have the primary oocyte and only one layer of follicular cells. And then around it, we have some stromal cells, okay? Each month after puberty, FSH and LH stimulate the development of these primordial follicles. A few of them start to grow, developing into primary follicles. The primary ovarian follicles consist of a primary oocyte surrounded by several layers of granulosa cell. So remember back here, we just have one layer of follicular cells. So when it becomes several layers, they become granulosa cells. The glycoprotein in the zona pelliculata forms between the primary oocyte and the granulosa cells. Theca folliculi is an organized layer of stromal cells surrounding the basement membrane. Usually only one of these primordial follicles will reach maturity each month. Okay, so this is a late primary ovarian follicle. We have the primary oocyte here. There's a zona pellucida here. We have several layers of granulosa cells and then a basement membrane. These cells have become what's called the theca cells, or the theca folliculi. And they're kind of like this organized, it almost, when you see it in a slide, it looks like a whirlwind or a cyclone almost, because they're thinner and they look like this. They're kind of like, it almost gives a feeling of movement. So, all right, continuing on with the oogenesis, in the secondary follicle, the theca folliculi differentiate into theca interna, which are the internal layer of cuboidal cells secreting androgens, and the theca externa, which is the outer layer of the stroma and collagen fibers. The innermost layer of granulosa cells becomes what's called a corona radiata. The granulosa cells secrete fluid that builds up in the cavity in the center of the secondary follicle, and this is called the antrum. So here we have the secondary ovarian follicle. We still have a primary oocyte with the zona pellucida around it. All of these granulosa cells, they create this antrum because they have been secreting this fluid here. Okay. Some of the granulosa cells have formed right around the zona pellucida, and those are called the corona radiata. External to the basement membrane, we now have two layers of these theca cells. There's the theca interna, immediately external to the basement membrane, and then a little further out is the theca externa. Here you can see a secondary ovarian follicle in a slide format. Again, primary oocyte, around it, granulosa cells, but closer to it are the corona radiata. Here's a big antrum, and then we have the theca cells on the outside, okay? The secondary follicle then matures into a tertiary or Graafian follicle. While in the mature follicle, the diploid primary oocyte completes meiosis I, producing a haploid secondary oocyte with the majority of the cytoplasm and a haploid first polar body. Once the secondary oocyte is formed, it begins meiosis II, but stops in metaphase. Ovulation occurs when the tertiary follicle or the Graafian follicle is released into the, it ruptures and releases the secondary oocyte, the first polar body, and the corona radiata. So here's a mature tertiary or Graafian ovarian follicle. We still have that huge antrum, secondary, or this is a primary oocyte that's going to become a secondary oocyte. We have the granulosa cells. This looks really cool, this SEM. We have the granulosa cells here, primary oocyte, and the theca. At ovulation, both cells in the corona radiata enter the uterine tube. If sperm are present and fertilization takes place, only then does the secondary oocyte, which is haploid, continue into meiosis II. At this point, an ovum is formed and a second polar body. The ovum then becomes a zygote during the fertilization when it unites with the sperm. All right, if you could please pause this video and watch the oogenesis video and then come on back. Okay, welcome back. So oogenesis, this is the process in which we're going to create the gametes for females. So in the fetal development, oogonium are undergoing mitosis. That gives us primary oocytes. Meiosis I occurs during fetal development. After puberty, the primary oocytes are complete. They complete meiosis I, which produces a secondary oocyte here and the first polar body. So this happens still in puberty and fetal development. The secondary oocyte begins meiosis II. The secondary oocyte and the first polar body are ovulated. So at ovulation, if fertilization occurs, then meiosis II resumes. So here we have our fertilization, meiosis II occurs. We end up with the ovum being fertilized, and we have the second polar body. This fertilized ovum is what's called a zygote. So that is 2N or a diploid. So if you could please pause the lecture video and watch fertilization video now, and then come on back. Welcome back. Here's a summary of oogenesis and the follicular developments. So here, this is a nice figure. So we have all this yellowish area occurs during the fetal development period. Oogonium undergo mitosis to create primary oocytes. And at this point, it's in a primordial follicle. It undergoes meiosis and it creates this primary, the oocyte is stuck kind of in this prophase I of meiosis. In the childhood, there's no development, they're all primordial follicles. When puberty occurs, the primary oocyte, still in the prophase I, develops within this the primordial follicle becomes the primary ovarian follicle, and then the secondary ovarian follicle. Meiosis 1 is completed by one primary oocyte each month. So when that happens, we end up with the first polar body and a secondary oocyte in metaphase 2. At this point, the follicle is a tertiary ovarian follicle. So it's the most developed, the Graafian follicle we kept talking about. So at this point, the tertiary follicle ruptures and expels that secondary oocyte in ovulation. So the secondary oocyte is ovulated. If a sperm comes along, then it's going to fertilize it, and meiosis 2 is completed, and we end up with this fertilized ovum, and also we end up with a second polar body here. So we end up overall in the way that if you learned meiosis, you start out with one cell and we end up with 4 that are half the number of chromosomes. So that's what we have here. We started with 1 oogonium and we end up with 4 of these haploid cells. Okay, the polar bodies, they just degenerate. All right, uterine tubes. We mentioned those. They're also known as fallopian tubes or oviducts. Females have 2 of them. They extend laterally from the uterus to the ovary. They are the path for the sperm to reach the ovum and for the secondary oocytes and fertilized ova to travel to the uterus. They're funnel-shaped near the ovary, and this funnel-shaped end is called the infundibulum, and they open to the pelvic cavity. Fimbriae project from it. The ampulla is the widest, longest portion of the tube. The isthmus is a short, narrow portion attached to the uterus. All right, so this is kind of a weird view. We're looking from the backside of a female. Like we're looking, if you look here, you can kind of see that. And then they've cut through half of it so you can see the inside. All right, so we have the uterus here in the middle. Off of the uterus, we have these tubes. Here's one on that side, and then we have this one here that hasn't been cut through. So this is what it looks like without the sectioning. So we have this little tube, it gets wider near the end, and it has this fimbriae at the end, right next to that the ovary. Now, if we look at the cut through section, we can see that fimbriae are attached to the infundibulum of the uterine tube. So this wide funnel-shaped area. That becomes more narrow during the ampulla of the uterine tube, and finally it narrows down very close to the smallest portion, and that attaches to the uterus at the isthmus of the uterine tube. Okay. So secondary oocytes are released here, and then they float into this uterine tube. At this point, they may just keep coming down and not be, or it may keep coming down and not be fertilized. If there was sperm injected into the vagina that make their way into the uterus, they can swim up and then fertilize in this uterine tube. And then the fertilized zygote travels down and implants in the uterus. Okay, the histology. Uterine tubes have 3 layers. There is the internal mucosa, the middle muscularis, and then the outer serosa. Simple ciliated columnar epithelium of the mucosa contains cilia that help the fertilized egg or secondary oocyte move towards the uterus. PEG cells in the tube secrete a fluid providing nourishment for the ovum. So here we have a transverse section of the uterine tube. We're seeing, this is the lumen over here. So this is like the inside, or it'd be like the surface, I guess that would be. So this would be the inside here. This would be part of that tube. You can see all that cilia, which is going to help propel the ova or fertilized zygote. And then deep to it, we still have these PEG cells. They're non-ciliated, and they're what's going to release a solution. that helps with that. All right, the uterus. The uterus is part of the pathway for sperm deposited in the vagina to reach the uterine tube. It's the site of implantation of the fertilized ovum. This is also where the fetus develops during pregnancy. And this is the site of labor. It is the source of menstrual flow when implantation does not occur. All right, so this is that same picture we had previously, and we're going to go over the uterus here. So there are anatomical subdivisions. The first is the fundus. The fundus is the top part of the uterus. Okay, down here it'd be like just like this little top. The body is the central part, which we have labeled here. And then the cervix is the inferior extension into the vagina. So here you see the vagina down here. This little portion is the cervix. The isthmus is located between the body and the cervix. So that's this little part right here, right above the cervix before the body. And we have that labeled. Now the uterine cavity is the interior of the body. That would be where the fetus develops during pregnancy. The cervical canal is in the interior of the cervix. That's the part that dilates. When you hear like, oh, she's dilated to 10 centimeters, that's the part that they're going to be checking. The internal os is the opening of the canal into the uterus. And the external os is the opening of the canal into the vagina. The location of the uterus, if you look at the sagittal plane of a female, we have this part right here, and this is the bladder, okay? So the bladder is here. The uterus is this one right here, okay? Back here, this is the rectum. So the uterus is connected here to the vagina, okay? And then here we have, with the bladder, we have the urethra, okay? And this is the external genital areas. And as a landmark, this is the pubic symphysis here. And obviously the sacrum and the coccyx. So anteflexion is a description of how the uterus lies in a typical woman. It can change, but this is how we say that the uterus is positioned. So the uterine body projects anteriorly, see how it's going forward to, this is the anterior section, the anterior portion of the body, and superiorly over the bladder. So it goes like that. The cervix projects inferiorly and posteriorly and enters the anterior wall of the vagina at a nearly a right angle. So it's interesting, you have this, you have the vagina going up here, but the cervix is almost at a right angle here. Ligaments hold the uterus in this antiflex position. So if we take a transverse section of the female here, again, this is the front where they have the abdominal muscles. This is the uterus and it's over the bladder here. So how does it stay there? Well, I've outlined these 4 ligaments. We have the broad ligament here. And the broad ligaments are actually double folds of the peritoneum, and they attach the uterus to the sides of the pelvic cavity. There are uterosacral ligaments. Uterosacral ligaments, I think that's how you say it. They are right here. They're peritoneal extensions connecting the uterus to the sacrum. The cardinal ligaments are inferior to the bases of the broad ligaments, and they connect the cervix and vagina to the pelvic wall. So the cardinal ligaments are right there. And round ligaments are dense connective tissues between the layers of the broad ligament, and they attach the uterus just inferior to the uterine tubes to the labia majora. And so round ligaments are up here. Histologically, there are 3 layers to the uterus. There is the outermost perimetrium, or the serosa, and laterally it becomes that broad ligament. So perimetrium is the outermost. The myometrium is the middle layer, and remember, myo means muscle. So this consists of 3 layers of smooth muscle. During labor, it responds to oxytocin to produce coordinated contractions to cause childbirth. The endometrium is the innermost layer. Its functional layer is shed each month during menstruation. So there are 3 layers. The endometrium has the compact layer, which is closest to the center of the uterus, like where the baby would be developing. The functional layer is the middle one, and that's shed every month. And then the basal layer is permanent, and it gives rise to new compact and functional layers after menstruation. And I should say that the compact layer is also shed during menstruation. So these 2 layers during a woman's period, they are shut off, and then the basal layer continues to create more functional and compact layers. So here we go. Functional and compact layers are sloughed off during menstruation due to declining progesterone from ovaries. All right, so here we see the histology of the uterus. Up here would be the lumen of the uterus. And then we have compact layer, functional layer, and then basal layer. That's all endometrium. Then we have the myometrium here, okay? Now this side on the left is the 2nd week of the menstrual cycle. And then on the right, we have the 3rd week of the menstrual cycle. So the functional layer is much bigger. The basal layer is deeper, so we have more of this endometrium. Okay. And here you can see, again, this is all endometrium. The basal layer is down here. We have some endometrial glands, and then the functional layer is up here with the compact layer at the very edge, all right next to the lumen of the uterus. Okay, cervical mucus. Secretory cells of the cervix produce what's called cervical mucus. This is chemically more hospitable to sperm during ovulation because it's less viscous and more alkaline. It nourishes the sperm, protects the sperm in hostile environments, and it aids in capacitation. So here we see an SEM of the endometrium during the secretory phase. So we have this mucus being produced here. All right, the vagina. The vagina is right here. It leads up to the uterus. It's a fibromuscular canal lined with mucous membrane that extends from the body's exterior up to the cervix. It functions as the receptacle for the penis during sexual intercourse. It's the outlet for menstrual flow, and it's also the passageway for childbirth. The histology. The mucosa of the vagina is continuous with that of the uterus. It has non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. Now we want the stratified squamous epithelium so that there's a layer of protection for the friction that occurs either in sexual intercourse or in childbirth. And then areolar connective tissue. These lie in a series of transverse folds. So the inside of the vagina has little folds, and these are called rugae. Why would we want rugae? Rugae is always found in areas where we want there to be some sort of expansion. So we have it in our stomach. So when we eat a lot, it can expand. So in the vagina, either for sexual intercourse or even more so during the childbirth process. The mucosa contains large stores of glycogen, which decompose and they produce organic acids, and that results in an acidic environment. The acidic environment is good because it retards microbial growth, but it is bad just because they harm sperm. That's why the semen has to produce an alkaline environment. More histology. The muscularis is composed of an outer circular layer and an inner longitudinal layer of smooth muscle. This allows the vagina to stretch during intercourse and childbirth. Here we see a transverse section of the vaginal wall, the inside or the lumen of the vagina. The mucosa has non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. The muscular layer, we have two smooth muscle layers, the outer longitudinal, the inner circular. The hymen is a thin fold of vascularized mucous membrane that partially closes the inferior portion of the vagina. All right, I thought we had a picture of the hymen too somewhere. If I see it, I'll point it out. All right, the vulva or the pudendum. The vulva is basically all the external genitalia. It includes the mons pubis. This is the elevation of adipose tissue that cushions the pubic symphysis. The labia majora, these are the two longitudinal skin folds. They're covered in pubic hair and contain adipose tissue, sebaceous glands, and apocrine sudoriferous glands. More medial, there is the labia minora. These are two smaller skin folds, and they do not have pubic hair or fat. There are few sudoriferous glands, many sebaceous glands, and they produce an antimicrobial substance that provides some lubrication during intercourse. The clitoris is a cylindrical mass composed of two erectile bodies, numerous nerves and blood vessels. It's capable of enlargement on tactile stimulation, and it has a role in the female sexual excitement. The vestibule is the region between the labia minora. It includes the hymen, the vaginal orifice, which is the opening to the vagina to the exterior, the external urethral orifice, which is the opening of the urethra to the exterior, and openings of the ducts of the paraurethral or Skene's glands. These secrete mucus and are embedded in the walls of the urethra. They're homologous to the prostate. The greater vestibular or Bartholin glands, these produce mucus during sexual arousal to provide lubrication. They're homologous to the bulbourethral glands in the males. The bulb of the vestibule are two elongated masses of erectile tissue, just deep to the labia on either side of the vaginal orifice. These become engorged with blood during arousal. That causes the narrowing of the vaginal orifice, and it places pressure on the penis during intercourse. So here we have the vulva, all the external genitalia. The mons pubis is where you're going to have the fat that protects the pubic symphysis, and it's covered in pubic hair. Also, the labia majora, those are going to have the fat on them, and they also have hair on them. Internal to them, you have the labia minora, and that's going to have no fat and no hair. More medial to that, or actually this is the vestibule right inside of the labia minora. Oh, here we have the hymen. That's what I was going to point out. We have the vaginal orifice, which is dilated. We have the external urethral orifice, which is the where the urine comes out. And then there's the clitoris right here. And then the anus, this person is laying on their back and we're looking between the legs. So the structures of the female and male reproductive systems are homologous, meaning that when a zygote is developing into either a man or a woman, a male or a female, then the initial embryonic tissue can go either way. It can become an ovary or a testes. The same embryonic tissue makes these two different structures, okay? So in females, the ovaries are homologous to testes. The ovum is homologous to sperm. Labia majora is homologous to the scrotum. Labia minora is homologous to the spongy urethra. So to me, that's very interesting because these two are they're almost similar in shape, a little bit different, but very like almost parallel to each other. And then the scrotum and the spongy urethra, they're not. The bulb of the vestibule is homologous to the corpus spongiosum of the penis and the bulb of the penis. The clitoris is similar to the glans penis and the corpora cavernosa. The periurethral glands are homologous to the prostate, and the greater vestibular glands are homologous to the bulbourethral glands. This chart is in your book. You may want to put a bookmark there so you can find that easily. All right, the perineum. This is a diamond-shaped area medial to the thighs and buttocks of both males and females. It contains the external genitals as well as the anus. The boundaries of the perineum are: anterior is the pubic symphysis, lateral are the ischial tuberosities, and posterior the coccyx. So here we see what the perineum is. It is diamond-shaped. We have the different landmarks as far as ischial tuberosity, the coccyx, the pubic symphysis. Now, if you draw a line from the triangle or the diamond lateral and medial edges here and create these two triangles, you then create the urogenital triangle up more anterior, and then the anal triangle inferior. Okay. Oops, thrown away. All right, moving on to the mammary glands of the females. Mammary glands are located in each of the two breasts of a female and are modified sudoriferous glands that produce milk. So remember, sudoriferous is a sweat gland. Mammary glands contain 15 to 30 lobes, and each lobe has lobules that contain milk-secreting glands called alveoli. Each breast has a nipple containing lactiferous ducts where the milk emerges. The skin around the nipple is called the areola. Functions. Lactation. This is the synthesis, secretion, and ejection of milk. Prolactin is a primary hormone stimulating milk production. Oxytocin causes the ejection of the milk, released from the posterior pituitary in response to a suckling infant. So how milk travels is that milk is made in the alveoli. It then travels through secondary tubules to the mammary ducts to a lactiferous sinus where some milk is stored. From the sinus, it then travels to lactiferous ducts to the exterior of the areola on the nipple. Here we can see a side view of the mammary glands and the breast. Okay, so here's a front view of it. Side view kind of makes more sense. So we start at the alveoli, which is found in this lobule. Okay, so alveoli here, the milk travels through the secondary tubule, down to the mammary duct, down to a lactiferous sinus down here, and then lactiferous duct, and then to the external nipple, which is part of that. Nipple is in the middle of the areola. Okay. And this is the end of part 2 of chapter 28. I will see you at part 3.